Hot-tempered Gordie Gallant was the WHA's first enforcer, an untamed outlaw who took on all the tough guys in the wild WHA. Even his coach wasn't spared from the man they called Machine Gun. Gordie Gallant was the most popular hockey player in Minnesota in the mid-1970s. He later brought his two-fisted style to Quebec City, where he was front and center in the league's all-time ugliest incident. Later in life, Gallant would transform from hockey goon to life-saving hero. This is the story of Gordie Machine Gun Gallant, the unpredictable and feared WHA rebel who put the fight in the Minnesota Fighting Saints.
He was one of those guys that had a short fuse and could go on the ice, could go in the saloon, or could go in the locker room. We never knew.
Gordie Gallant was born on October 27, 1950 in Shediac, New Brunswick, Canada. His future coach, Harry Neal, once asked Gallant's mom if Gordie was always so mean. Mrs. Gallant reportedly said, quote, "Let me put it this way. I had to tie a pork chop around Gordie's neck just to get the dog to play with him." To understand Gordie Gallant, you'd have to understand his childhood. He grew up in tough Pointe-du-Chêne, New Brunswick, a tiny English-speaking enclave in a primarily francophone area. He lived in a house with an outdoor toilet and a hand-operated water pump where his mother, a housekeeper, and his father, a construction worker, raised their 6 children. Gordie, the second oldest, remembers sharing a queen-sized bed with 3 of his brothers for most of his early years. And he remembers fighting, always fighting, every day of his young life. "It was bred into me to be a fighter," he says. "And when I was a kid, I loved it. I used to say, 'Let's go to Shediac and beat up some Frenchmen.' And one day my mom said, 'Gordie, you're French.' But I didn't know. I didn't speak any French. I was uneducated." By grade 11, Gordie quit going to high school. Instead, he opted to make $8 a day tending lobster traps. It was a hard-laboring occupation he credits with much of his success as a strong-armed enforcer. By the time he was 16 years old, Gallant left home. "My dad was an alcoholic," he said, "and he used to hit me all the time. And I finally hit him back." Meanwhile, he was quickly developing a reputation for the rough stuff in junior hockey ranks. "I was fighting everyone, and I was only a kid," he says. "I must have made some guys on the team nervous because I was traded. I later found out they sold me for a dozen sticks." Undersized for a tough guy at 5'10", 165 pounds, Gallant was never drafted and never played major junior hockey. But he earned enough attention as a fighter to earn a spot with the Syracuse Blazers of the Rough and Tumble Eastern Hockey League. Gallant gooned it up with the Blazers, but also scored 17 goals and gained the attention of the Minnesota Fighting Saints of the World Hockey Association. The Saints were in dire need of toughness, especially with superstar Mike Walton joining the team in 1973-74. Walton would need to be protected, and Gallant was the perfect bodyguard. Together, the charismatic duo became the most popular players in Minnesota. Gallant led the WHA with 223 penalty minutes, and his legend would grow in the 1974 playoffs as he instigated numerous confrontations with Houston's Gordie Howe and was an intimidating force throughout the series. He got help in the fisticuffs department from notorious Billy Goldthorpe, and together they became known as the G-Men while creating mayhem throughout the series. Ultimately, the Arrows would prevail, but the Saints drew huge crowds and Gallant became a fan favorite. He signed a 3-year contract, had a morning radio show, and earned multiple endorsements. The 1974-75 season saw the escalation of hockey's Goon era as teams in both leagues tried to copy the brawling style of the Philadelphia Flyers' Broad Street Bullies. The Saints fortified their muscle by adding the likes of heavyweights Jack Carlson, Kurt Brackenbury, and Billy Butters to join Gallant as the Fighting Saints lived up to their name and terrorized the league. In addition to racking up fighting majors, Gallant showed improved play, recording 10 goals. He added a goal in Minnesota's first playoff game, a 6-5 win over the New England Whalers in Hartford, Connecticut on April 9, 1975. It would be the last game Gallant would play that season. The next night was an off night, and according to Gallant, quote, "We met a few ladies, had a few bottles of wine, and the next thing you know, we look at our watches. Uh-oh, missed curfew." On April 11, 1975, the Fighting Saints and the Whalers would engage in the infamous Brawl in the Mall in Hartford. But Gallant missed the fun. he was already on a plane heading back to St. Paul. We'll let his coach Harry Neal tell the story.
We were going to play the first game of the playoffs against the Hartford Whalers, and I had a curfew because I knew we had a very explosive team on the ice and off. So I said, be in by midnight, and I started calling the rooms. And Mike McMahon, our defenseman, roomed with Gordie Gallant, and he said, Gordie's not here. About an hour later, an hour and a half later, Mike McMahon phones and says, Gordie came in and he's pissed off, and he's coming up to see you.
A lot of things happened, and that led up to a lot of things, and last night I was out 45 minutes late from curfew. I was late, and I was in the wrong. I went up to see Mr. Neal, and I exploded, you know.
10 seconds later, we hear the knock at the door, and I'm rooming with Jack McCartan, my assistant coach, and Jack's saying, don't answer the door. And it's Gordie yelling at me, and I said, come on, I mean, we've never had any trouble with Gordie Gallant before. So I open the door, and I'm in my underwear and no shirt, and I open the door, and whack, he suckers me.
I heard the door open, and I heard splat. There was Harry on his hands and knees bleeding, and there was Gallant in the doorway. So then him and I got into it.
And the next thing I know, I'm outside, Gordie's inside, and I hear Jack McCartan yelling, help, Harry! And the furniture was going wild. Jack was fighting with him.
Gallant was gone the next morning.
I don't think you can build a franchise out of fear, and I don't think any one individual can put himself ahead of the coach or the team or the franchise, and therefore a decision had to be made.
In 1975-76, Gallant landed with the talented Quebec Nordiques who had little interest in his improved hockey skills. As he said, quote, I was there to protect the Frenchmen. And the Frenchmen who need protecting were the Nordiques star-studded core of Marc Tardif, Réal Cloutier, Serge Bernier, Réjean Houle, and Jean-Claude Tremblay. And Gallant did plenty of protecting. His penalty minutes totals soared to 297. In round one of the playoffs, the Nordiques faced the underdog Calgary Cowboys, who realized they had one hope of competing with the powerful Nordiques. That was to bully and intimidate Quebec's top players, especially Tardif, the WHA's MVP. The Cowboys prevailed in Game 1 to set the stage for the infamous second game of the series. The date was April 11, 1976, exactly 1 year to the date of Gallant's Harry Neal punch-out. It would mark his final game as a Quebec Nordique. Calgary coach Joe the Crow Crozier was employing Goon Rick Jodzio to shadow Tardif. Early in the first period, Gallant fought with Jodzio to serve warning that Tardif must not be roughed up. Gallant said, quote, I was just trying to advise him not to bother Mark anymore. After a stretch in the penalty box, Jodzio returned to his bench. Then, suddenly, he was on the ice again, skating some 80 feet to reach Tardif, who was taking a pass to the left of his goal. Jodzio hit Tardif full force with a cross-check to the face. Tardif crumbled to the ice and was unconscious. Jodzio jumped on top of him and began swinging with both fists. Both benches emptied in a wild, hard-punching melee. Some 20 local policemen came onto the ice but did little or nothing to stop the dozen or more fistfights that kept the arena in an uproar for half an hour. Gallant racked up 2 majors, a match penalty, a minor, and a game misconduct. He'd be banished for the remainder of the playoffs. In the off-season, however, Gallant had a chance to return to his hockey home. Now, during Gallant's sabbatical in Quebec, the Minnesota Fighting Saints franchise folded, but the WHA, being the WHA, the Cleveland Crusaders also folded, but moved their franchise to St. Paul to become the new Minnesota Fighting Saints. Seeking a box office impact, the new Saints acquired Gallant. But Gordie Gallant was somewhat more subdued in his second act in St. Paul. There's too much fighting anyway, Gallant said at the time. I guess maybe we can all do with a little rest. A couple of years ago, that's all I wanted, to fight. And that was fine with the people I worked for. I got the idea that if I didn't fight, they didn't need me. But I'm too old for that now. I'll still knock people around, but not like I used to. Gallant and the new Saints played well, but it wasn't enough as the cash-starved franchise folded at the All-Star break. Gallant was signed by the Birmingham Bulls, where he proved he could still antagonize the opposition, including Quebec Nordiques defenseman Jim Dory. On February 4, 1977, the Bulls hosted the largest crowd in WHA history, 17,489, and Gallant did not disappoint. In the second period, he jumped Quebec's Paul Baxter and then squared off with Jim Dory. He was sent to the penalty box. Soon after, while Gallant was still serving a misconduct, Dory led a 4-man rush out of the Quebec zone, but he stopped the center ice right in front of the penalty box. Dory wheeled, and sent a slap shot right at Gallant's head. He ducked, and the puck struck a photographer standing right behind him, knocking him flat. Later, Baxter and Gallant agreed to settle their beef in the hallway, but as they dropped the gloves to fight, Dory raced in and thrust the blade of his stick towards Gallant, just missing his eye and slicing open a nasty gash requiring several stitches. By the way, the bloodied photographer won a six-figure lawsuit. Gallant failed to latch on with the bad news Bulls of 77-78, and he sat out the entire season. But the next season, he made an unlikely comeback with the Central Hockey League Salt Lake City Golden Eagles, the farm team of the St. Louis Blues. The next year, Blues GM Emile Francis offered Gordie a contract after he played 3 1978 NHL exhibition games. But Gordie declined the offer and retired. He said, "I was tired of fighting, and I was in love with my girlfriend at the time." The relationship lasted 12 years, but the NHL regrets remained. He said, "That still bothers me to this day. I should have played that one game in the NHL. I guess that's the only regret I've got." Late in the season, however, Gallant was coerced to unretire by none other than ex-Calgary Cowboys coach Joe Crozier, now the head coach of the AHL Moncton Alpines. He played well, scoring 5 points in 5 postseason games, and among his new teammates, old nemesis Rick Giadzio. After hockey, Gord changed his life. In fact, he became devoted to physical fitness. He was in better shape after hockey than he ever was during his playing days. He later joined the Canadian Army and had 2 tours in Croatia. Gordie's life had begun to settle down. But then came the early morning darkness of June 20, 1998, when all that violence was behind him, when he'd long returned to his hometown of Pointe-du-Chêne, and when he awoke to the sound of a terrible hissing. The water heater in his girlfriend's one-room cottage had somehow ruptured. It was spewing scalding spray everywhere, and by the time Gallant pulled his girlfriend and her young son from the terrible shower, he had suffered burns to 80% of his body. Gallant's condition was critical. His pain was so great he spent most of the next 2 months in an induced coma. His chances looked so slim that a priest administered last rites on 2 different occasions. He eventually returned home to begin a long and grueling rehabilitation. The entire province of New Brunswick rallied behind him and hailed him as a hero. Gallant began running youth summer baseball leagues in his hometown. He was affectionately called the Pied Piper of Pointe-du-Chêne. He loved giving back to the community and positively impacting its youth. "I love kids," Gallant said in a 2000 interview with the National Post. "I see the innocence in them. We were all that innocent at one time. Then there's always the other side to us. There's always the dark side to us. But the good outweighs the bad."